Greetings and welcome to another episode of Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Alice Lovejoy, Professor of Cultural Studies, Comparative Literature, and Moving Image, Media and Sound at the University of Minnesota as our esteemed guest on today's podcast episode. Dr. Alice is a media and cultural historian whose work explores the intersections of government, institutions, and media technologies in a global context. Her latest book, Tales of Militant Chemistry, The Film Factory in a Century of War, published by University of California Press this month, 2025, traces the history of film through the factories that produce it, moving between the United States, Germany, and Belgian Congo and the Soviet Union to uncover the military, colonial, and environmental entanglements of cinema's chemical foundations. Her first book, Army Film and the Avant-Garde, Cinema and Experiment in the Czechoslovakia Military, published by the Indiana University Press in 2015, co-winner of the Modern Language Association's 2018 Eldo and Jenny Scaglione Prize, examined the rise of the experimental film culture with the Czechoslovakia Army's film studio between 1929 and 1969. It garnered multiple honors, including commendations from the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies and the Czechoslovakia Studies Association, and included a DVD of 13 Ministry of Defense films. Dr. Lovejoy's current projects extend to the post-war history of children's film and television institutions worldwide, from Yugoslavia's Film and Child Commission to Iran's Kanun, East Germany's National Center for Children and Film Television, and UNESCO's International Center for Films for Children and Young People. She co-edited Remapping Cold War Media Institutions, Infrastructures, Translations from Indiana University Press in 2022 with Mary Pajala and has published extensively on chess and Slovak film and literature. Beyond academia, Dr. Ellis has worked as a film critic, curator, and filmmaker, including as an editor at Film Comment. Her research has been supported by the ACLS, Fulbright, the Howard Foundation, and the other distinguished fellowships and awards. In this episode, Dr. Alice Lovejoy offers thought-provoking insights from her latest book, Tales of Militant Chemistry, The Film Factory in a Century of War. So, without further delay, let's welcome Dr. Alice Lovejoy to the podcast. Dr. Ellie, it's an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
It's a real pleasure to be here as well. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Professor, your new book, Tales of Militant Chemistry, reframe the history of film in an unexpected way. What first led you to explore the connection between cinema and the chemical industries of war?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are two ways in. The first is that I began my studies in university by studying filmmaking, and so I've always been very interested in film as a physical medium, what it feels like, what it smells like, what happens when it decays, when it's processed in certain ways, and these are questions that have to do with chemistry by and large. The second thing that brought me to this project is that much of my research has explored the intersections between film and the military. So you mentioned my first book, which is about the Czechoslovak military. Um, and so when I came across a mention of the Eastman Kodak Company's work for the Manhattan Project, it brought these two threads together and was really the seed for this new book.
Dr. Ellis, when we think of film history, we often picture directors, stars, and studios, not uranium and enrichment plants. How do you help readers make the leap from Hollywood glamour to the industrial and militant realities behind it?
Yes, this isn't a picture we're familiar with, right? We think of film as something that's about snapshots and home movies and Hollywood, but it's also been very much tied since its beginnings to the chemical industry. And this asks us to think in very different ways about film and photography. So one of the examples that I explore in the book is the Eastman Kodak Company, which I've just mentioned, which is a corporation that all of your listeners will know. There are very few corporations that are so mythologized as Kodak. There are few that had played such an important role in our family lives and our everyday lives, especially during the era in which photography was on film for the most part. But throughout its history, Kodak has long been also a chemical company, and this is the same for all of the companies that have made film and photographic products. So, for instance, in the case of Kodak, it made film, but it also made rayon, and it made plastics, and it made pharmaceuticals, and it made weapons, and was or made other tools of war, things that were used in military vehicles or in parachutes, things like that. And these were profitable product lines for the company. So, for a lot of your listeners, this is going to sound very familiar. This is a story about diversification, about raw materials and chemicals being used to make not just film and photographic products, but also products in other lines, right? Diversifying for a company is a very natural thing to do, especially in the case of the chemical industry. It's also about vertical integration, about companies like Kodak buying and making factories that made the raw materials to make these products. And these factories were around the world, and that's one of the things that the book tracks as well as the global dimensions of this history. But to your question about how I make that leap between film and the chemical industry, these raw materials, these chemicals, these factories, and the people who worked in the factories are really key to drawing these connections. And they become the basis of the stories the book tells. So you've got it on the screen behind you. It's called Tales of Militant Chemistry. And I look at these stories in particular through the Agfa company in Germany, and specifically its factory in the eastern German town of Wolfen, and at the Tennessee Eastman Corporation in Kingsport, Tennessee, which was, for much of the 20th century, Kodak's largest chemical subsidiary.
The Belgian Congo plays a key role in your narrative. How does its colonial history tie together uranium for nuclear weapons and the raw materials for film production?
Yeah, so let me begin the story by backing up a little bit and just giving some groundwork for how Eastman Kodak and Tennessee Eastman came to the Manhattan Project, which was one of the key stories in the book. So Tennessee Eastman was founded as a methanol supplier for Eastman Kodak. Methanol was a product that the company used to make its films, and it was born in a former methanol plant that had been used during World War One in Tennessee. But it quickly became a supplier of cellulose acetate, which is the slow-burning plastic that we still use today in things like our glasses. But that became very, very central to a kind of film that Kodak developed in 1923, which was 16 millimeter film, the kind of film that many of your listeners will know through home movies or films that you might have seen in a classroom. And cellulose acetate was extremely important to film history because up to that point, up until its development in the early part of the 20th century, most film was made on cellulose nitrate, which is a form of nitrocellulose and extremely explosive. And so there's lots of histories and stories in cinema's early years of film fires and films catching on fire while they were being transported, films catching on fire when they were being stored. And cellulose acetate changed this game. But it didn't do so right away. And so there's a business history too, because Tennessee Eastman and Eastman Kodak didn't start mass producing cellulose acetate until the company knew that there was a need for the substance outside of film, because they weren't yet sure that 16 millimeter film would be a really viable market. And so they began producing it for other products, especially rayon, artificial fibers, artificial silk, which was, a big product in the 1920s, the 1930s. It was seen as a kind of, important and miraculous invention. And so this led the company to make other cellulose acetate products, such as plastics. And it gave it skills in mass production, and specifically mass production using these chemicals that go into cellulose acetate, that allowed the company to be involved both in manufacturing the anti-submarine explosive RDX during World War II, and then eventually to running the Y-12 uranium separation plant at Oak Ridge for the Manhattan Project. And now this wasn't because Tennessee Eastman or Kodak had any skills or knowledge of uranium separation. It was because they were really good at mass production. They were very good at operating large enterprises. And so they ended up there. And to your question about the Belgian Congo, most of the uranium that the Y-12 plant used, most of it was from the Belgian Congo. And this is a story that plays out throughout the Manhattan Project, and it's one that I trace through the diplomatic and the cultural histories that made Belgium keen to market its colonies raw materials for use in military purposes, which had to do to a large degree with Belgium being occupied at the time and not wanting to maintain its sovereignty after the war ended. Um, but I think about the ways in which this story of uranium's extraction in the Belgian Congo for use in the bomb echoes colonial histories that had always been part of making film, always been part of film's raw materials. So we can think of gelatin, for instance, which was often sourced from colonial administrations in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And this is not just for Kodak or Agfa, this is for all film manufacturers. We can think of camphor from Taiwan. And in the United States case, we can think of cotton, which was a very crucial raw material for film that was always closely caught up with the system of plantation slavery that was so fundamental to the United States. And so uranium, again, to go back to your question, it wasn't directly used to manufacture film, but the colonial dimensions of these two industries are very caught up with one another.
Professor, across the Atlantic, AGFA was deeply involved in Nazi Germany's war machinery. What parallels and differences do you see between AGFA's and Kodak's wartime roles?
Yeah, so Agfa has really a parallel history to Kodak, but it's caught up with it too because the two companies were major competitors, especially in the 20s and 30s, and always trying to outdo one another, make better products, gain each other's markets, etc. But during the war, World War II, Agfa was part of the notorious IG Farben chemical cartel, which was closely involved with Nazi Germany's military-industrial complex and is much better known than Kodak's involvement with the United States military-industrial complex. So we can't directly compare at all the scale of the two companies' involvement with the war's violence. So Agfa did similar kinds of military research and development for the war. Worked on films that could be used by fighter planes. Worked on infrared films. It did all kinds of film development. It also was part of a military industrial system that relied on and was inseparable from Nazi Germany's concentration camps. So again, there's really no comparison of the extent of the violence and entanglements that we see in terms of the industrial production. So, as I talk about in the book, AGFA systematically used forced laborers and concentration camp prisoners to make its film, its fibers as well, because it also made rayon. And this also returns us to the colonial histories that we were just discussing, because many of these laborers were from areas in Europe, especially Eastern Europe, that Nazi Germany saw as part of its own empire on the continent. And many of them came from Poland, Russia, and Ukraine.
Dr. Ellis, after 1945, film factories stood at what you call the front lines of a new colder war. How did the Cold War change the stakes for companies like Kodak and Agfa?
Yes, things changed quite a bit for both companies after 1945, and they changed differently. But this was really a process of each company coming face to face with the consequences of its wartime work. So in Agfa's case, the Wilfen factory that I write about became the site of really intense competition between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union for the plant's raw materials, its intellectual property, its tools, its technologies, as they wanted to capitalize on the German army's defeat to use those technologies for their own purposes. So this has been written about quite a bit in the case of military technologies and other technologies. It just was sort of a free-for-all as everybody was going through and trying to take what was left in Germany. And this was particularly the case at the Wilfen factory, Agfa's Wilfen factory, with color film, because Agfa had developed a kind of color film that worked extremely well, that was better than other technologies out there. And the formulas became spoils of war. This is a well-known history in film. But the quotation that you started this question with has to do with a story that I track with Kodak that begins in around 1950. So nuclear testing after the war really began increasing around 1950, 1951, and Kodak was possibly the first company to grasp the extent and the hazards of fallout from these tests, of nuclear fallout. And it did this because it started discovering small spots on its unexposed film. So this is film that hadn't been sold yet, it hadn't been exposed yet, it was sitting, waiting to be sold. But because film responds to radiation, whether that's light or radiation like from an X-ray, the fallout that ended up on the film was creating little spots that made it impossible to sell. So I think about the ironies here of a company that helped make the atomic bomb finding its business threatened by the consequences, by fallout from similar bombs. But what happened next makes the story even more complicated because the Atomic Energy Commission began giving Kodak advanced warning of nuclear tests, and not just Kodak, but all photographic manufacturers in the United States. So they could, for instance, not use a raw material that may have been in the fields at a time when fallout was predicted. But people living near the film factories weren't given the same warnings, right? So they knew that there was radiation in the snow and in the rain that was coming down because this was in the newspapers at the time. But they were told that it wasn't dangerous. So the film factories were seen as too big to fail, and this is a key tension that the book thinks about.
Very interesting. Professor, your book links film production to environmental hazards like radioactive fallout and toxic waste. Can you share an example that illustrates the environmental legacy of this history?
Yeah, so the fallout story is certainly part of this because this is a story of environmental damage from a product really caught up with the film industry. But there has been really wonderful scholarship on film and media and in environmental humanities, which has shown just how dirty the business of making film is and always has been. Many of the chemicals that factories used are toxic, and all over the world they were seeping or being spilled. Outside factory walls, which caused environmental harm, human harm, animal harm. And so many of the US plants that I write about have been Superfund sites, so sites that merited government attention in terms of their cleanup. And in Germany, Agfa's film factory, the one that I write about, sent gallons of toxic runoff into local waterways. And this is damage that is still being remediated today, decades after the factory closed. So we may not use film very much anymore, right? Most of us are taking photographs with our phones and our digital cameras, but its materials and legacies will stay with us in an environmental sense for a very long time, even when there is no film anymore.
In following scientists, soldiers, prisoners, and spies through these industrial networks, what personal stories most surprised or moved to you?
That's a great question. I will highlight one story, which is of a Ukrainian woman named Alexandra Lavrik, who was arrested by the Nazis in her hometown of Dnipro in Ukraine, and brought to the concentration camp of Ravensbrück in Germany, which is the women's concentration camp. And at Ravensbrück, she was selected to work in the Agfa film factory in Wilfen. And her story is extraordinary. I mean, she worked making film as well as rayon in really terrible conditions. And she survived. And at the war's end, as the remaining prisoners working at the factory were put into a transport, likely being evacuated to their deaths, she managed to escape from a train and to make her way, in large part on foot, back to Ukraine and to her family. So for the rest of her life, Lavrik carried lung injuries from the factory that she was working in Germany with her. But there's also a tragic addition to her story that really highlights the links the book draws between film manufacturing and the nuclear industry, which is that after the Chernobyl nuclear power plant explosion in the 1980s, one of Lavrik's sons was forced to go clean up the aftermath, and he was poisoned by radiation. So her story is very much a story of the 20th century in more ways than one.
How does seeing film as a chemical cousin to poison, gas, and nuclear weapons change our understanding of the cultural products it helped create?
Yes, this is a great question too. And I think we can think about it by jumping forward in time to contemporary media. And again, the cell phones and tablets and computers that we use. Because I think often we think of these media as things that allow us to escape the world, that allow us to connect with friends or to watch a TV show, to when we go to the movies, we sort of disconnect from the world for an hour or two, right? Or maybe we're doom scrolling on our phones and not thinking about the world around us. But this example of films, military entanglements, the entanglements that exist on a very basic level through chemicals and materials, shows I think the webs of power that are at work in all of our everyday interactions with media. So I think we need to be attuned to these stories, to the military questions, the environmental questions, the political questions here, and we need to think and rethink about how we make and use media. I don't have a prescription here or an answer about what this might look like, but these are questions that are certainly coming up in the case of contemporary media when we think about the rare earths that these technologies depend on, when we think about the environmental costs of their disposability, of just how short their lives are. But this book shows how much deeper these questions go back to media like film that I think we often think of as part of a more innocent age, right? An age before the climate crisis. But in fact, they were very much part of the same history.
Dr. Ellis, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Given the book's revelations, what do you hope listeners will take away about the hidden histories behind every media technologies today?
Yeah, so the answer that I've just given to the last question is part of this, right? To think how far media extends beyond questions of culture or entertainment or how we do our everyday work, how these webs, in the very, technologies that we have, how these webs extend across borders to people we've never met, maybe to places we've never been, and to products and industries that we might think of as having nothing to do with media. But another takeaway is about the complex consequences of military and industrial entanglements. And I think the story of Kodak's involvement with the Manhattan Project, which really ends or continues through this history of fallout, is one of these stories. So again, a weapon that the company helped shape, like many, many other private companies during World War II. I will say this is certainly not an isolated case, but that this weapon ended up being damaging to the company's bottom line. And so the government gave it privileged information to protect its products, but that is information that didn't go elsewhere. And so there's a larger story here about moments in US history, even recent US history, where industry has mattered much more than people. And what this means and the consequences of this. And there are echoes of this history today, as we watch the Environmental Protection Agency rolling back policies on industrial pollution. So these are questions that have to do with health beyond industrial health. They have to do with the health of communities, of people, of the environment, and so on.
Listeners, it has been a privilege to host Dr. Ellis Lovejoy on today's episode. Her deep research and unique perspective reveal a hidden chapter of film history, one that connects the magic of cinema to the chemical, military, and colonial forces that shaped the 20th century. Tales of Militant Chemistry not only reframes our understanding of film, but also challenges us to think about the unseen histories behind the media we consume today. Dr. Lovejoy, thank you for sharing your insights and for taking us on this fascinating journey across factories, battlefields, and the film reels. And to our listeners, if today's conversation has sparked your curiosity, be sure to look out for Tales of Militant Chemistry when it's released in August 2025 in India and across the world. Thank you, Dr. Alice Lovejoy, once again.
Thank you. This has been a fascinating conversation.